It started on the Monday before Thanksgiving in 2004. I was in the Santa Monica apartment I'd sublet to a friend while working in New York, half dressed for bed, when the phone rang. My mother's voice came through, strained and hesitant, asking if I'd spoken to my father. I hadn't. He hadn't returned my call, hadn't called, hadn't come home since he picked me up from the Long Beach airport 3 days earlier. I was 30, back in Los Angeles for the holidays, and suddenly the familiar warmth of home felt like it was cracking around me. Thanksgiving had always been sacred in our family. Not in the religious sense, my parents weren't religious, but in a way that made the day feel holy. I'd never missed it, even when the rest of my life was a whirlwind of movement and uncertainty. Growing up, my parents, Eleanor and Jonathan, had been anything but conventional. They were atheist, socialist activists, nicknamed me Jenny Marx after Karl Marx's wife. Never just Jenny. Holidays weren't a given in our house, but Thanksgiving, strangely enough, was treated as though the universe itself demanded our attendance. I could picture it as if it had happened yesterday. Fort Greene, 1974. The apartment teeming with friends, bodies pressed against every wall, some perched cross-legged on the floor, laughing over bowls of steaming food. My father, king of the kitchen, orchestrating a feast that could feed an army, never complaining beyond a mock groan or wiping the sweat from his brow, always acting like the martyr while secretly relishing the chaos. My mother glided through the living room, her floral arrangements impeccable, her laughter mixing with the raucous debates about global warming, presidential elections, or the latest film. Music drifted through the air, Dixieland, gospel, Dylan, and every sound added to the feeling that we were alive, really alive, in a world that had so little predictability outside that room. I had inherited a love for this chaos. By junior high, I'd begun inviting friends over, and our house became the epicenter of teenage social life. My parents were the cool parents, and my friends often wished they were their own. My mother had a way of taking in kids who needed a safe space, like Lisa and Anya, and our door was always open. That generosity, the mix of chaos and care, was part of what shaped me. It was the foundation of my world, a framework of laughter, chaos, politics, and meals that ran into the night. By 2004, though, things had shifted. I was living in New York, a city that pulsed with endless energy and distraction, and this Thanksgiving was meant to be quieter. 8 years had passed since my younger brother Charlie's suicide, and for the first time, my parents and I had agreed on a subdued, intimate holiday. Just the three of us. No friends, no overflow of laughter, no chaos, just fragile attempts at normalcy. The kitchen had always been my father's domain. As a child, my mother, my brother, and I tiptoed around, careful not to intrude, though the smells that came from that forbidden space pulled us in like magnets. The aroma of roasting turkey, sweet potatoes, green beans, the tang of cranberries, the heavy scent of freshly baked bread, it was impossible to resist. We would hover, pretending to be helpful, only to be shooed away with mock irritation, his voice a mix of frustration and theatrical exhaustion. The table, when finally set, was a display of order and beauty. Tiffany silver polished to perfection, flowers arranged with care, every fork and knife in its place. My father's antics, the dramatic sighs, the joking threats of ordering pizza if there wasn't enough food, became rituals, part of the theater of Thanksgiving, part of what made our family feel whole. And yet, life in 2004 was already pulling me away. I had returned to LA from New York, anticipating the holidays, but a subtle undercurrent of dread had begun to creep in. I remembered the times my father had disappeared before, mini midlife crises that had sent him packing to Sedona without warning. I comforted my mother over the phone, sure that he would return by Thanksgiving. But there was a nagging, impossible to quiet thought in the back of my mind. What if this time was different? When I arrived at my parents' home on Wednesday morning, the late morning sunlight streaming through the windows, the scene was almost unbearably quiet. My mother sat in her usual spot on the antique wicker chaise, still in her bathrobe, toes twitching nervously. Her green eyes, wide and unblinking, betrayed the fear she wouldn't voice aloud. I forced myself to smile, to act nonchalant, but beneath the surface, a storm was gathering. Still no word. Nothing. The timing was cruel. 7 years after Charley, the holidays had begun to ease. Now, fear and uncertainty returned, an unwelcomed echo of the past. Charley's death was always near the surface of our lives. In 1996, 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, he had jumped from a freeway overpass near our home, ending his life at the age of 28. This was not his first brush with death. 5 years earlier, a psychotic break in Oregon had led him to drive off a cliff, miraculously surviving. And there had been wrist slittings, overdoses, and even a Swiss Army knife attempt that narrowly missed his heart. Diagnosed with schizophrenia, psychosis, and bipolar disorder, his life had been a constant swirl of hospital visits, medications, and episodes of mania or despair. Moments of clarity and laughter were fleeting, often followed by chaos, pacing, sleepless nights, and interventions. Those experiences left an indelible mark on our family, shaping the way we navigated fear, grief, and hope. By Thursday morning, the house felt almost uninhabitable. The empty spaces my father had left seemed to breathe, inhaling and exhaling silently, each sound amplified. The ticking of the old brass clock in the hall, the occasional creak of the floorboards, the hum of the refrigerator, everything a reminder that he wasn't here. My mother, usually composed and practical, moved in slow, deliberate motions, as if she were trying to will herself into believing everything was normal. But her hands betrayed her, trembling slightly as she poured coffee, rearranging the same vase of chrysanthemums 3 times before finally setting it down, eyes darting to the doorway as though expecting him to appear at any moment. I wandered through the kitchen, trying to occupy myself. I picked up a knife and poked at a loaf of sourdough he had left out. Imagined slicing it for Thanksgiving, but the act felt hollow without him. The turkey he had been supposed to prepare was still frozen, untouched, a silent accusation. I thought about calling a local catering service, but my mother's sharp intake of breath stopped me. She wasn't ready to give up on the illusion that he might walk through the door any second. That's the thing about people you love. They make hope stubborn, even when everything else screams otherwise. By evening, sleep was impossible. I lay in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling, remembering every holiday meal, every stolen glance, every argument and reconciliation. I thought about the recurring pattern in our family, the way we dealt with crises, not by confronting them directly, but by moving in waves, treading carefully, masking panic with humor, and hoping for the best. It had worked before. It wouldn't work this time. Charley's death had already proven that. Friday arrived like a storm rolling in from the coast. The house was quiet, heavier somehow. My mother refused to eat, insisting that she would only have Thanksgiving when he returned. I tried to coax her, to prepare something small, but she shook her head, resolute, refusing. The world outside seemed to move forward, cars honking, people shopping for Black Friday deals, the city alive, but inside, time had frozen. I decided to take a walk, anything to escape the oppressive atmosphere. The streets were lined with holiday decorations, twinkling lights reflecting off wet asphalt, people rushing past with bags in hand. The contrast between the world outside and my own reality was jarring. I passed a cafe and caught a glimpse of a man through the window, laughing with friends. For a fleeting second, I imagined it was my father, happy, unburdened, somewhere far from this suffocating anxiety. But the image dissolved as quickly as it had appeared, leaving only the ache of absence. Returning home, I found my mother on the porch, a blanket over her shoulders, staring at nothing. The silence stretched between us like a living thing. I sat beside her, feeling the weight of shared grief and fear, realizing that this was not just about my father. It was about the unraveling of the fragile sense of security we had built over decades. The foundations were cracking, and we were helpless to repair them. I didn't sleep that night either. Thoughts spun endlessly, scenarios of disappearance, danger, betrayal, and madness. I imagined him wandering unfamiliar streets, disoriented, perhaps needing help but too proud to seek it. I imagined the worst, as one does when hope is stretched thin. And yet, even in the deepest recesses of fear, a small voice whispered that he might return, that the story was not finished, that perhaps the ghosts of our past could coexist with the future that was still possible. By Saturday, desperation had taken root. I contacted the local authorities, friends, and neighbors, each call a mix of pleading and disbelief. And then came a breakthrough. A tip from a neighbor who had seen a man fitting my father's description entering a small, obscure bookstore in Venice, 2 blocks from the beach. My heart leapt, a fragile spark of hope in the midst of despair. I didn't wait. I grabbed my coat and rushed to the address, anticipation and fear colliding in equal measure. I arrived at the little bookstore as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and violet. The place looked almost forgotten, tucked between a shuttered cafe and a laundromat, the kind of shop that might hold secrets better than the internet ever could. Its windows were fogged, dusty, displaying a chaotic mix of novels, postcards, and knickknacks. A small bell jingled as I pushed the door open, and the smell of old paper and dust hit me immediately, a comforting, grounding scent amidst the chaos of my thoughts. Inside, the store was narrow and dim, lit by a single row of pendant lights that cast pools of warm yellow over the stacks of books. Shelves rose to the ceiling, laden with titles that ranged from classic literature to obscure treatises I couldn't even begin to pronounce. Somewhere near the back, a man's voice hummed softly, almost imperceptibly, as he flipped through pages of a worn paperback. My heart skipped a beat. Every instinct screamed that it could be him. I moved quietly, trying not to disturb the fragile stillness, each step careful over the uneven wooden floor, and then I saw him, my father. He was seated on a small stool, hunched over a book, his face hidden by the brim of a baseball cap. For a long moment, I just watched, unsure whether to speak, whether to shatter this strange, fragile scene. He looked different. Not older, but lighter somehow, as if he had shed an invisible weight. And yet the tension around his shoulders, the way his fingers fidgeted with the edges of the pages, betrayed the turmoil I had imagined. "Dad?" My voice broke the silence, small and unsure. He looked up slowly, and for a heartbeat, I thought he wouldn't recognize me, or worse, that he wouldn't want to. Then his eyes met mine, and everything shifted. Relief, confusion, shame, and love, all colliding in that single, overwhelming glance. We left the bookstore together as twilight descended. The streets of Venice were alive with joggers, tourists, and the soft echo of waves. And yet the world felt different now. Lighter, quieter, like a tension had lifted. My father spoke little, but the simple act of walking side by side, talking in fragments, sharing the unspoken understanding of what had been lost and what could still be mended, was enough. That night, we returned home together. My mother was asleep on the sofa, exhausted, a blanket wrapped around her shoulders. I carried my father's bag, the smell of books and paper clinging faintly to it. He didn't speak much, and I didn't ask. Words weren't necessary at first. We simply settled back into the rhythm of home, a fragile, tentative step toward normalcy. In the days that followed, the tension began to unravel. We cooked together, small meals, shared quiet dinners, and gradually began to speak of Charley, not just in memories that hurt, but in stories that made us laugh, stories that reminded us that grief and love could coexist. My father didn't explain everything. He never could, perhaps, but he stayed. That was what mattered. Thanksgiving came, muted but sincere. The turkey was smaller than usual, the decorations simpler, but the house rang with life once more. My mother smiled more freely, I laughed more easily, and my father, though still carrying a shadow of his absence, was present. The wounds were not healed, not entirely, but they were acknowledged, tended to, and for the first time in weeks we breathed together, a family fractured, but not broken. And as I lay in bed that night, listening to the soft rhythm of the household, I realized that some absences can teach us more than presence ever could, that silence can speak, and when it finally ends, it can bring us back together in ways we never expected. The next morning, Venice felt different. The streets were quieter, almost reverent, as though the city itself was aware of the fragile peace settling into our lives. My father and I walked side by side again, the weight of unspoken apologies between us gradually easing, though not disappearing entirely. Every corner, every cafe, every bridge seemed to hum with stories waiting to be rediscovered, and for the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe without the gnawing anxiety that had haunted me since his disappearance. We stopped at a small bakery, the kind where the smell of fresh bread wraps around you like a warm hug. My father ordered a loaf and 2 pastries, and I watched him with a strange mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This was the man who had left us in turmoil. Yet here he was, tentative, almost shy in his attempts to rejoin life, as though he were testing the waters, unsure if the world would accept him again. "Do you remember this place?" I asked quietly, pointing to a faded sign above the door. He nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "I used to bring you here when you were little," he said, his voice carrying the fragile tone of someone rediscovering a lost memory. "You always wanted the chocolate croissants, even if it made you sick." I laughed softly, the sound breaking the tension that had clung to the mornings like a stubborn fog. "I guess some things never change," I said, taking the pastry he offered. For a moment, I allowed myself to see him as he had been before, the father who laughed with me, who scolded gently, who loved fiercely, and not just as the man who had vanished. As we walked back, I noticed how my father observed the world differently now. His eyes lingered on the details, the ways sunlight reflected off the canals, the subtle changes in the buildings, the quiet life unfolding around us. It was almost as if his absence had given him a new lens, a chance to notice what he had ignored for so long. I realized then that his disappearance, painful as it had been, had also opened a path for reflection, for growth, for understanding that none of us could have achieved otherwise. Back home, my mother was awake, tending to the small garden she had coaxed back to life over the past weeks. She looked up as we entered, her eyes meeting my father's, and for the first time since he returned, there was no guarded hesitation, no flicker of doubt. She simply nodded, a quiet acknowledgement of the step forward we had all taken together. The tension that had clung to our home like a shadow was easing, replaced by something tentative, but precious: hope. In the following days, conversations began to flow more naturally. We spoke about Charley, about the grief we had all carried, about the small regrets that had accumulated over years of misunderstandings and unspoken emotions. My father admitted, in fragments, the depths of his fear, his shame, his sense of failure. We listened without judgment, and in listening, we found a bridge across the chasm his absence had created. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky in fiery hues, we sat on the balcony, the sounds of the city mingling with the soft lapping of the canal water below. My father handed me a notebook, its cover worn and pages yellowed with age. He said, I started writing. Thoughts, memories, things I couldn't say out loud. I opened it carefully, reading passages that were at once raw and tender, filled with regrets, but also with glimpses of hope. He had documented the emptiness, the confusion, the moments of clarity, and the realization that running away had only prolonged the pain, for him, for us, for everyone he loved. We didn't need to speak much that night. The words in the notebook carried the weight of reconciliation, of understanding, of a bond slowly being rebuilt. My father and I exchanged glances, a silent acknowledgement that we were both navigating uncharted territory, that the path ahead would not be without difficulty, but that it was now a path we could walk together. In the weeks that followed, life began to settle into a rhythm that felt new yet familiar. We shared meals, laughter, and even tears, embracing the fragility of our second chance. My father started helping in small ways around the house, taking interest in routines he had once ignored, offering advice, sharing stories, and, most importantly, simply being present. I realized that the absence that had haunted us was no longer a gaping void, but a space that had allowed growth, reflection, and the forging of stronger bonds. We had learned that family is not merely about proximity, but about presence in every sense of the word. And presence, I understood, required patience, forgiveness, and courage. The courage to face the past and the courage to rebuild, brick by brick, day by day. As autumn descended and the air grew crisp, I watched my father walk along the canal with a quiet sense of purpose. He was not the man he had been, nor the man I had imagined in his absence, but someone renewed, tempered by the trials he had faced, and ready to embrace the family he had once left behind. I felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that we had endured the storm and emerged not unscathed, but stronger, connected in ways that absence and silence could never erase. That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about Charley, about the void that had brought us pain, and about the fragile, enduring strength of love and forgiveness. I realized that life, with all its unpredictability and sorrow, also held the capacity for restoration. And in that restoration, I found hope, not just for my father, for my mother, or for myself, but for all the fractured pieces of life that can, with time, patience, and understanding, be made whole again. The following weeks unfolded like a slow, deliberate dance, each day layering upon the last, forming a rhythm we hadn't known for years. Venice, once merely the backdrop to our pain and uncertainty, became a canvas for renewal. The bridges we crossed were no longer symbols of distance, but of connection, carrying us from fractured moments into shared experiences. My father's presence, tentative at first, began to feel like a steady current, reassuring yet unassuming. And I realized that healing often does not arrive with grand gestures, but in quiet, persistent consistency. We ventured into corners of the city I had never noticed, small alleys lined with forgotten flowers and cafes that smelled of espresso and old wood. My father, whose eyes had once seemed perpetually distant, now lingered over details. The way a cat slinked across the stones, the ripple of sunlight on the water, the laughter of children echoing across narrow streets. He pointed out things he had seen as a boy, stories he had never shared, and I listened with a mixture of awe and understanding. The man who had disappeared from our lives was here, yet he was also someone entirely new, shaped by absence and revelation. And I realized that redemption is never about returning to who we were, but embracing who we can become. One evening, as we watched the sun bleed into the horizon, my mother joined us on the balcony, carrying a small tray of tea and pastries. She sat quietly, her presence a gentle acknowledgement that the past, with all its shadows, was being softened by acceptance. We didn't need words. The silence was shared and comfortable, an affirmation that the space between us had begun to close. We laughed about trivial matters, argued playfully about inconsequential things, and in doing so rediscovered the ordinary joys that often slip through life unnoticed. At night, I would sometimes find myself reading my father's notebook again. Each passage revealed not only regret, but also self-discovery. He wrote of fear, of loneliness, of shame, but also of clarity, of gratitude, and of the determination to confront his failures rather than flee from them. It struck me that writing had been his quiet therapy, a way to untangle the knot of emotions that words spoken aloud could never fully capture. I realized that everyone carries their own burdens, often hidden, and that compassion is not merely about absolving mistakes, but about understanding the unseen struggles behind them. Slowly, trust rebuilt itself in layers. My father started to offer advice without imposing, to share stories without overshadowing, to participate in routines without hesitation. We celebrated small victories together, completing errands, cooking meals, sharing laughter over minor mishaps. Each day was a quiet testament to resilience, a proof that life, when nurtured with patience and empathy, could reclaim joy from the edges of despair. I began to notice a change in myself, too. The anger and resentment I had carried, once sharp and unyielding, softened into comprehension. I understood, perhaps for the first time, that absence is not always abandonment, and that people, even those we love most, are capable of imperfection, of faltering, and yet of profound redemption. This realization brought a calmness I had never anticipated, a sense of closure not imposed by circumstance, but earned through engagement, through willingness to forgive and reconnect. Our conversations began to touch on the future, not in vague, abstract terms, but in concrete ways. My father spoke of aspirations, of projects he wanted to embark upon, of life lessons he hoped to impart. And I listened, not as a child seeking guidance, but as a partner in understanding, a witness to transformation. We planned outings, small adventures, and even considered traveling beyond the city, imagining experiences that once seemed impossible after the disruption of his disappearance. One chilly afternoon, as autumn leaves rustled across cobblestones, I found myself walking alone along the canal. The water mirrored the sky, fractured and fluid, yet steady. I reflected on the journey we had undertaken, the fear, the grief, the moments of uncertainty, and the slow, deliberate steps toward reconciliation. I understood that life would continue to test us, that pain and loss were inevitable companions, but also that the capacity for connection, for love, and for renewal was far stronger than I had ever imagined. My father joined me quietly, his presence familiar and grounding. We walked without speaking for some time, the silence comfortable, punctuated only by the occasional distant bell or the laughter of passers-by. He finally spoke, voice low and contemplative. "I don't know if I can ever fully make up for the time lost," he admitted. "But I want to be here, truly here, every day from now on." I looked at him, really looked, and nodded. That's all anyone can ask. Presence matters more than perfection, and I can see you're here. We continued along the canal, the city unfolding around us like a living storybook, and I realized that life, in its endless complexity, often provides second chances not because they are easy, but because they're necessary. Redemption, reconciliation, and understanding are processes, not destinations. And the true measure of love is found in persistence, in patience,
and in the willingness to face the imperfections of those we hold dear. In the weeks that followed, we embraced routines with renewed energy. Mornings were spent planning small tasks, afternoons wandering through streets lined with golden leaves, and evenings filled with conversation, tea, and the quiet joy of shared presence. My father began to teach me things he had once assumed I already knew: small life skills, observations about human behavior, reflections on courage and resilience. And in teaching, he revealed himself anew, not as the father who had vanished, but as a man who had learned, suffered, and returned ready to contribute meaningfully to the lives of those he loved. As the year moved forward, I found myself filled with a sense of gratitude that was both surprising and humbling. Life had not been easy, and loss had left scars. Yet those very scars were evidence of endurance, of lessons learned, and of the capacity to heal. I understood that family is not defined solely by blood, but by commitment, by shared experiences, and by the persistent effort to maintain connection, even when the path is steep and uncertain. One evening, as we watched the sunset bleed across the horizon, my father placed a hand on my shoulder. "We've been through storms," he said softly, "but the important thing is that we are still here, together, and that we keep moving forward." I felt a swell of emotion, not sorrow, but clarity, a recognition that life's trials are temporary, that reconciliation is possible, and that love, when nurtured with patience and understanding, has the power to heal even the deepest wounds. Venice, with all its timeless beauty and quiet resilience, became not only a backdrop to our lives, but a symbol of what is possible when absence is met with presence, when mistakes are met with forgiveness, and when hearts, though tested, remain open to growth and renewal. In the quiet moments, as night settled over the canals, I reflected on the journey we had taken. It had been painful, uncertain, and at times overwhelming, yet it had brought us here, to a place of understanding, connection, and hope. I realized that life is a mosaic of moments, each shaped by choices, by actions, and by the willingness to confront the past while embracing the future. And in that realization, I found a profound peace, knowing that we had not only survived, but had emerged stronger, closer, and more capable of cherishing the fleeting, beautiful, and fragile gift of life and love. There was a subtle joy in noticing the ordinary again, the way sunlight filtered through the leaves, the laughter of children echoing across narrow streets, the aroma of freshly baked bread drifting from corner bakeries. These small details, once overlooked, now seemed imbued with significance, reminders of the continuity of life and the resilience of the human heart. Our family, once fractured by absence and grief, began to weave a new pattern of connection. Shared meals became celebrations of endurance, not perfection. Conversations were filled with curiosity rather than reproach, and moments of silence were no longer heavy with tension, but warm with mutual presence. We began to carry forward the lessons of absence, understanding that vulnerability and imperfection were not weaknesses, but gateways to deeper connection. On one crisp morning, my father and I walked along the canal, the light catching the ripples in the water like scattered jewels. He stopped and gestured toward a small bridge. "This was where I used to bring you when you were little," he said, his voice soft, tinged with nostalgia. "You always wanted to race across it. I remember thinking your energy could conquer anything." I smiled, feeling a sense of continuity and reassurance. "I guess some things never change," I replied, and we laughed together, a sound that felt light and unburdened, a stark contrast to the heaviness that had filled our home just weeks ago. The holidays approached once more, but this time the fear that had haunted us for years felt tempered by resilience. We gathered around the table, not with the expectation of perfection, but with gratitude for presence, for survival, and for the bonds that had endured. The turkey was roasted, the table was set, and the rooms were filled with warmth, not just of food or decor, but of shared human connection, of understanding, and of quiet, enduring love. As I lay in bed that night, listening to the gentle rhythm of the house, I realized that life's most profound lessons are often learned in the spaces of absence and return. We cannot control every outcome, shield ourselves from every pain, or prevent every fracture, but we can choose presence, compassion, and resilience. And in that choice, we reclaim not only love, but hope itself. In the months that followed, we continued to nurture these lessons. Our family walks, our quiet dinners, our shared laughter became traditions, not out of obligation, but out of intentionality. The absence that had once loomed like a shadow was now a space of reflection and understanding, a reminder of fragility, but also of enduring strength. And in those moments, I realized that healing, much like life itself, is not a destination, it is a continuous journey, one step at a time, marked by patience, empathy, and the courage to embrace both the past and the unknown future. We discovered the power of small rituals. Sunday mornings were spent at the bakery, picking out pastries and sharing coffee. Midweek evenings became a time for simple dinners and storytelling. Even chores were transformed. Doing laundry, preparing vegetables, or setting the table became opportunities for conversation, reflection, and laughter. The ordinary tasks of life, once burdens, became reminders of stability, connection, and shared responsibility.
My father, once distant and preoccupied, began contributing in ways I had not anticipated. He shared memories from his childhood, lessons he had learned the hard way, and insights about resilience and perseverance. I listened, sometimes surprised, sometimes laughing, but always appreciating the openness and vulnerability he offered. In these moments, the man who had disappeared was no longer a shadow of absence, but an active participant in our shared life. One afternoon, while walking along the canal, my father paused and gestured toward a row of small, colorful houses reflected in the water. "I never noticed these when I was younger," he said softly. "It's as if being gone gave me eyes to see what I couldn't before." I smiled, understanding that absence had reshaped not only him, but also the way we all experienced the world. His disappearance had forced us to confront uncertainty, fear, and loss, but it had also created the space for renewal, awareness, and gratitude. In the quiet aftermath, we learned to see more deeply, feel more fully, and treasure moments we might have previously taken for granted. The notebook he had left me continued to serve as a guide, a mirror reflecting his thoughts, fears, and reflections. We began to write together, exchanging notes about our days, our feelings, and our hopes. These written exchanges became an extension of conversation, a private dialogue that deepened understanding and built a bridge across gaps that words spoken aloud sometimes could not reach. Evenings on the balcony became sacred. We watched the sun set over the water, shared quiet reflections, and occasionally spoke of Charley. Not only the sorrow of his absence, but also the joy of remembering him in ways that celebrated his life. Laughter returned, soft and tentative at first, then more freely, a testament to the healing that had taken root. As winter arrived, bringing crisp air and early sunsets, I realized how much had changed. The fear that once defined our holidays had been replaced with a quiet confidence that we could navigate life's uncertainties together. The fragility that had seemed so overwhelming now felt like a gentle reminder of the importance of presence, patience, and shared resilience. One late autumn evening, my father and I took a long walk through a neighborhood market. He paused by a stall selling handmade candles and picked one up. "It's funny how something so small can light up a room and make it feel alive." I nodded. "It's the same with people," I said. "Even small gestures, small presence, can make a difference in someone's life." He smiled, a faint glimmer of the man I had always known, yet someone transformed by experience. He said, "I want to keep lighting up our lives,
even if I stumble sometimes. I realized then that forgiveness is not a one-time act, but a continuous practice, a commitment to understanding, patience, and empathy. My father's return was not the end of pain or struggle, but the beginning of a new chapter, one where trust, connection, and love could grow, nurtured by the lessons of absence. In the weeks that followed, our family solidified routines that were both comforting and liberating. We learned to appreciate silence without tension, laughter without pretense, and conversations that allowed vulnerability without fear of judgment. Life had regained a rhythm, not perfect or predictable, but authentic and alive. During one late autumn evening, I watched my father repair a small wooden chair that had been broken for years. His hands moved carefully, intentionally, and I marveled at the quiet dedication he brought to such a small act. It struck me how restoration, whether of objects, relationships, or trust, requires patience, attention, and care. Each repaired chair, each shared meal, each walk along the canal became symbolic acts of rebuilding, both tangible and emotional. The next Thanksgiving arrived. This time, the table was filled with gratitude rather than anxiety. We roasted the turkey, prepared the sides, and set the table together, each action imbued with intention. My father offered guidance without dominance, my mother moved with ease and warmth, and I found myself embracing the chaos and imperfections that had once seemed overwhelming. As we sat down to eat, I realized that absence had not destroyed us, it had strengthened us. The fragility of our family had become its resilience. The silence of our past had become the foundation for communication, and the fear of loss had become an awareness of love's depth. We were together, not perfectly, but completely present. That night, as I lay in bed, listening to the gentle hum of Venice at night, I reflected on the journey we had undertaken. Absence had taught us more than presence ever could. It had revealed vulnerabilities, tested patience, and forced reflection. And yet, through it all, it had allowed for a new depth of connection, an enduring understanding, and a shared joy that could only exist where pain had once lived. Life continued, unpredictable and challenging, yet filled with renewed hope. I understood that love is an ongoing practice, a daily commitment to presence, compassion, and patience. Our family, once fractured by grief and absence, had discovered the power of resilience, forgiveness, and the quiet strength of shared humanity. And in that understanding, I found peace. A peace born not of perfection, but of presence, not of certainty, but of trust, not of absence, but of return. Venice had become more than a city. It was a mirror of our journey, a testament to the enduring power of love, and a reminder that even the deepest fractures can be mended when hearts are willing to try.